Hello, everyone out there, and welcome to the Living Youth Podcast. We're doing something a little bit different today. Both Mr. Robinson and myself have been really busy, and I'm actually on the road today on the way to a TWP. And so we look back through our archives and realize that there are some from our earliest days, the earliest days that we did any podcast at all, and recognize we have never put those on Apple or Spotify. They have been on YouTube, but we're talking about like some within the first 10 that we ever did more than 2 years ago. So we are going to experiment today and give you what we will affectionately call a classic episode. This one features Mr. Mark Sandor in the studio with us. I say the studio. It was, I think, my office back then. But classic is us being kind to ourselves. We think it's a classic, of course. But you're going to notice a few differences. Some of you may have heard this one. A few of you did listen to this. Back then, the listenership was a bit smaller. But in this one, you'll notice that our audio is not nearly as good. That's because we had an old USB mic just sitting in the middle, I think sitting on my desk. So the sound quality is not as good. I'm warning you ahead of time about that. But at the same time, it was still us, and it was wonderful to have Mark Sandor in. And in this particular podcast, we were wanting to take advantage of Mr. Sandor's sense of history. You know, Mr. Mark Sandor does have a history degree, and we thought, hey, let's have him in while he's here, and let's talk about some history. In particular, we wanted to talk about with all the different ways that history is taught, all the different ways that history is discussed. The fact is, we're reliant on experts to understand what happened in the past because most of us don't have the time to dig into a lot of history on our own, and even when we do, we tend to be going to works that digest that history for us. Most of us don't go to primary sources for everything. That'd be rather difficult. And so we talked to Mr. Sandor to get advice for our teens and our young adults about how to understand history and to keep our biblical brains intact while we do so. So I know this is a little bit different. Give us some feedback. We have just a few more, actually not many more, that we might try and do something like this with. Some of our earlier podcasts that didn't have a lot of traction because it was in the early days when most people didn't even know we were doing a podcast, and also some that we only released on YouTube. We didn't have Apple, we didn't have Spotify, we didn't have Google Podcast or any of the others at the time. So, and again, like I said, the sound recording quality will be poor, and hopefully it won't ruin the experience for you. You can still hear us. It's just obviously not still cheap, but at the same time, not as terrible setup that we have now. So again, we hope you enjoy it very much. And for those who are listening before the Sabbath starts, we hope that you have a wonderful Sabbath. Hey, Mr. Robinson.
Hello, Mr. Smith.
It's good to see you here.
Thank you. It's good to be seen.
Who is this to your right?
He's on my left, Mr. Mark Sandor.
This is not a good start for me. Thank you very much for joining us here for the podcast. Again, it's me and Mr. Robinson, and we do have a guest who is on the left of Mr. Robinson, not his right, and that would be Mr. Mark Sandor, minister in. How would you describe your area, Mr. Sandor?
I suppose I would be serving as pastor over Minnesota and western Wisconsin.
All right, beautiful area, very cold this time of year.
Yes,
I will be there. Actually, I don't know when we're actually going to put this online, probably in a week or so, but I will see you by the end of this month here in February. Looking forward to the family weekend up there in Merrill, right?
Correct.
To see the crowd up there. Love all them very much. And today, we were actually recording 2 podcasts, and I'll be up front. This is the second time we've attempted this first podcast. What is this? A Garage Band on my Mac.
The first time literally crashed and burned.
First time it crashed and burned. We've done so many demo tests and the rest, and it crashed. So we're actually redoing this one. Our goal was 2 podcasts with Mr. Sandor. We went ahead and thought, well, let's skip this one, then do the second one. We've done the second one. We hope you'll listen to that and listen to us be incredibly intelligent, discussing the U.S. Constitution and the balance between freedoms and responsibilities. But for this one, we did want to talk about something else. This what is supposed to be the first podcast, and certainly the first one we'll post. Mr. Sandor is a historian. You know, I know you've got a degree in history, a master's. Is that right?
No.
No. Sorry about that.
Yeah, straight to the.
Well, just leave then. Why don't I have you here?
No, I have a bachelor's in history. But yeah, when I was in college, I was originally going to get a minor in history. But then when I started keeping the Sabbath and realizing I needed a job that would allow me to keep the Sabbath, I decided to look at teaching. And if I was going to teach anything, I decided to aim for history, since it was, the minor was already there. Bumped it up to a major and did that. Now, to your point, though, I did go back and take some master level history classes at a couple times, years and years ago at this point. But never quite got it done. I think essentially you had to more or less take 10 classes. I believe I finished 6, so slightly over halfway there, but was unable to.
60% mastery.
Yes,
Mr. Sandor.
So just a
which an
F.
F.
Yeah. Maybe a D. Might be a D.
Maybe a D. Okay, we'll go with a D. But I have both Mr. Robinson and I have known Mr. Sandor for a long time, and actually his love of history is part of what I've really enjoyed about our relationship, because I'm not a history guy. I'm a math guy. I love math and I love the sciences, but not really history. And it was interesting, of my children, Benjamin, my third son, was the one who found he really loved history and got his degree in history, just finished this past semester, has got a job full-time, boy making money, which dads appreciate. And it just his take on history and how much he enjoyed it was was refreshing, because it was about the people and it was about the events and the excitement of what was going on, and I've really appreciated that. In particular, though, in the podcast, we're trying to focus on how to think biblically about things, because the world presents us with lots of ideas and questions, whether it's culture, whether it's pop culture, whether it's going on in media. How do we think about those things biblically? So I really thought it would be great to have you on the podcast to talk about how to think about history biblically. And you just did your talk to the Living Education students on Tuesday. Was that sort of the theme, or was it something else?
I think that was at least half of the theme, I would say, because I did want to stress some maybe overall more general topics in terms of the importance of history. But I do think that when we're in God's church and we're using the Bible and looking at the Holy Word, God has such a variety of ways of inspiring people to put things in His Bible. We have a collection of Psalms. We have many letters. Some are personal, some are to congregations. But a decent chunk of the Bible is recording just historical information, telling the history of the Israel, the patriarchs, the Israelites, the kingdoms, just snippets about some of the Gentile kingdoms and the relationship with the Persians in particular. And then it kind of skips to the New Testament, where you get the Gospels and the book of Acts largely being kind of focused on events and history, before again the Bible kind of changes tones into the epistles.
I'd like to ask a question of you, and I am, just for the audience to know, I'm springing this on Mr. Sandor. He didn't know I was going to be asking this, but I am curious to see if he has any advice in this regard. And I can speak for myself. When I'm going through the history in the Bible, like I've been recently going through some of the kings of Israel, going to Israel really made me want a better sense of the different reigns and how they transitioned. Sometimes it can seem a little dry. It's not. I haven't found an equation yet. I've been looking for some algebra, and I've been sadly coming up empty. For some of our young people who are listening, as teens and young adults, if they want to have a better sense of the history of the Bible, but they are finding it maybe a bit dry at times, or it seems like just a bunch of facts, do you have any advice that you would give? It could be certainly the Bible, but even more broadly in terms of how you approach history. Do you have any advice for some of those, so that they are able to maybe kind of get through it in a way that doesn't feel like they're just driving themselves with a whip?
I think one of the best pieces of advice that I'm stealing from somebody else, but I don't remember my source, is they said when you start to read history, and they were talking about just normal history books you'd find at a library or wherever, but I think it applies to the Bible as well. they said it's kind of like you walk into a room full of strangers who all already know each other. And so you walk in and you're like, okay, all these guys are talking to each other, they all know each other's names, and they are throwing them around like I should be on the same page with all of them. And the point was basically, give yourself time, because at a certain point, you'll start to feel more familiar with the names. Talking about the kings of let's just stick to Judah even right now. You read through that and you might get to the end and you're like, well, name some kings of Judah, and you're like, David, and then you
Solomon,
right,
Solomon,
and then Jehoram, you start really guessing, and then but the second time through you're gonna, and maybe you get some more, but you don't get them in the right order. Okay, well, there's David and Solomon and Josiah and Hezekiah, and someone who's read it more is gonna be like, well, but Hezekiah was that's fine. You're getting some names down, and then eventually you're able to be like, well, okay, well, it's David and Solomon, and then there was also I tend to try to target the good kings, so I was like, okay, so there's, now I'm going to add in Asa and Jehoshaphat, and then it's Hezekiah before Josiah, and then occasionally I can start piecing in even some of the others, but I mean, to this day, I cannot tell you from David to, because Josiah's the last good one, but now who is it at the very end of the kings of Judah? Zechariah? Does that sound? I mean, the one who Nebuchadnezzar captures,
Right.
Kills his kids and puts his eyes out. Anyway, that guy. Yeah. Oh man, talk about a guy. Anyway,
one of the history podcasters mentioned that very specifically.
Yes,
like the horrific ways these what's the term? The absolute monarchs had over, and then when they conquered you, it was bad.
Yeah. Did you say Zedekiah a while ago?
I was close to it, but that's the one I was thinking.
Yeah.
I don't think I quite got Zedekiah, but
I think it is.
I believe so. That sounds right. Okay. So where was I going with? Oh, but just again, you're in a room with people you don't know, and if you give yourself time, you're going to start to become more familiar with it. Now, one of the nice things, if you're going to jump into like just a secular history book, if you look for a good author, they'll make sure they pace how they introduce you to people, and that can be a real benefit. Now, not all authors are like that, but like one of my personal favorites is Stephen Ambrose, because I do think he does a good job of letting you get to know people, and also maybe when he circles back to somebody he's introduced before, he knows you've forgotten them, so he reminds you why you know that guy. Who's another one? The lady who wrote the Team of Rivals about Abraham Lincoln.
Oh, there's several men here at headquarters who talk about. They say it's an excellent book. Really
Excellent book. And
Team of Rivals about Abraham Lincoln.
She does an excellent job. And Doris Kearns Goodwin, I'm pretty sure that's her name, but she again does an excellent job introducing you to the people in the room, especially during that first 50 pages of a book, which is kind of like, oh, I have to slog through 50 pages before I feel like I know the people in the room. And it's kind of like, welcome to history. It's like even mentioning the kings of Judah. Well, you might have to slog through it, a few times before you start feeling like you know the names and you can remember what their stories are about.
You're saying that does make me think that it is a matter, nothing good in the world comes without effort. Sure. And it's a matter of taking the time to get to know these characters. What you're saying, because you're prompted two thoughts, I'll try to get to both of them and not forget the second. But one of them, it does remind me of Mr. Ogwyn, Mr. John Ogwyn. Was so blessed to have him as a pastor for almost a decade, and one of the things I loved about listening to Mr. Ogwyn was he would talk about these biblical characters in history, and it sounded as though he knew them. Like he would talk about some event that they went through as if he were in the room watching it, not just making up detail. Don't get me wrong, he was great at adding color, and so that does makes you feel like you're in the room. But he would talk about the people themselves as if he had taken the time to get to know them. Mr. Robinson actually listens to Mr. Ogwyn's sermons fairly, occasionally. We'll talk about him every once in a while, and I've always appreciated your insights about how Mr. Ogwyn would present those characters.
Mr. Ogwyn really was so good at bringing the Bible to life, because it's so easy to read through there, just read the words, and you're like, I kind of get this is happening here, and it's just. But the way he brought these characters to life, one of the examples he used that always stood out to me was when he's reading the account in, I'm pretty sure it's Matthew, and the disciples have gotten a little discouraged and they think, well, maybe this isn't panning out, and they've gone back to fishing, and Christ comes up to where they are, and he recommends that they cast their net over in some other direction, and they're expert fishermen and know that's a pretty terrible idea, and so they do it anyway out of respect for him, and they pull up the fish, and then Peter falls down. I think he says he falls down in Christ in his presence, and he says, go away from me, I'm a sinful man. And I've read that plenty of times, and just keep moving on with the story. Well, he'll stop there and speak for the next 10 minutes about the implication of that, and how Christ. It wasn't like he would say something kind of like, Christ already knew that. He didn't need to figure it out. He needed Peter to come to that recognition. It's not like he was thinking, yeah, you're right, Peter. You are a sinful man. I'm going to have to start over with some different disciples. The whole lesson was there for Peter, and I don't know, just the way he tells it, and you really do start to envision yourself standing at the Sea of Galilee. If you've never been there, you can just imagine something, and I always imagine them in robes and sandals. Who knows if they actually went around like that, but truly a good add color, but it was always done in such a measured and plausible way. You never felt like he was starting to make up a new story. You were just like, yeah, that sounds about exactly how that situation would have been.
Right. He would talk about some of the ancient kings of Israel or Judah, and sometimes you read the things they do, and you think, how could a person do that? That doesn't make any sense. Or like even going back to when Esau sold his birthright for a bowl of soup, and you think, what a moron, right? I mean, why would someone sell their vast birthright when they're about to inherit a vast birthright for a bowl of soup? And it was examples like that, Mr. Gwynn, in terms of take the time to think about what it was like to live there and be there. And the more I thought about Esau and thought, yeah, he's been living with Jacob his whole life. And Jacob has always been the kind of guy who would have been, you could imagine Jacob easily needling his older brother Esau and saying, well, Esau, I'm glad you're getting the birthright, because you're just, I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm sharp and I'm fast and I'm witty and I'm going to have the future I want. I can build my own future. Esau, I got to be honest, I'm glad you're going to be taken care of in some way because you don't quite have my skills. And I'm glad that Dad's going to give you the birthright like that. And you have to realize these were real people living in these days. And the moment you start writing off these historical figures as if they're like a zoo specimen, you can't relate and learn the lessons. But the moment you realize, yeah, it'd be easy after a while, Esau, after you've had enough of that, saying, you know what, I don't need it. You bet. You can have it all, because I'm a man. I can make my own way. I don't need all this. And you start to recognize, no, if this is real history, then these really happen, and try to actually imagine yourself in that context. It does take time. I've benefited with the Gospels trying to pause every once in a while, like what you just described, and imagine, okay, what would it have been like? What would that conversation have been like? And also recognizing we don't always have all the details recorded, and which also would flesh it out and make it more realistic. Which brings me to the second point I did want to bring up, Mr. Sandor, because you had mentioned earlier in earlier conversation about how when it comes to history, we had to recognize not everything is in there. You only have whatever the historian has chosen to write. Could you elaborate on that a little bit? Because it was a great point.
Sure, yeah. And certainly, again, for our young people, I mean, first main lesson, if there's anything we can almost bring it back to, is give yourself time. I mean, give yourself time and don't feel like one read-through is going to do it. And be okay with the fact that you're starting down a path that you'll be very familiar if you keep on that path. But also almost as you're saying here to this other point, the idea that history is always interesting because you have to make decisions about what you're going to say and also what you're going to leave out.
You're talking about when it comes to writing history, when it comes to putting it together.
But to some degree, I mean, you could probably make the same case for oral history. I mean, as we've talked about sermons where I know Mr. Robinson and I had a long discussion about a sermon on a particular topic, and when I gave the sermon, now I'm curious to hear how Mr. Robinson would speak about the same topic, because there are some things he appreciated about what I said, but there's other things that his mind was already meditating on and going in a different direction that probably equally as valid points and things that appeal to him more about that particular topic, and he would make sure those got into the sermon. For me, they didn't quite make the cut because I've got an hour, and in the same thing with a history book is only going to be so long. We find one of the Gospels in John, at the very end of John, at the end of chapter 20, end of chapter 21, there's a couple comments that John just sort of was inspired to write, where he admits, I could have told you a lot more about Jesus. There is so much more I could have said, but this is sufficient for what the point is.
Right. What was Mr. Robinson, you had the exact phrase. What is it that John says there at the end?
Oh, it was something like, if all the things that he had done had been recorded in a book, the earth wouldn't have been big enough to contain all the books that would have been written about it.
Would have been a lot of books.
Right.
I appreciate what you said about, and that you mentioned the gospel accounts, because so a lot of people have a question about why are there four, which there's some reasons for that. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all cover very similar material. John, knowing what they all wrote from a different perspective much later in life. But for example, some people think it's the Gospels are contradictory because one guy says it one way and one guy says it's another, and that's always a mistake, because Luke was writing a much more historical style account, and so he would bring in certain detail that people who want to read more of it mentions the names of the Caesars and some other details like that, where Mark had no concern about that, and his is the action gospel, man. He hits the ground running. I think in the first chapter, there's been a healing, a resurrection, and a demon cast out. It uses the word immediately like 60 times in it.
His is the YA novel version.
Exactly. Matthew was writing to more of a blue blood crowd that wanted to know who is this Jesus? Is he qualified to be doing what he's doing? Is he actually the lawgiver that Moses talked about? And so that's why there's the different account. Like, to your point, depending on what detail you're trying to bring out, you'll record it a different way, and you can't cover every aspect of it.
Well, and in some ways, it's also just you have the sense of if we got to the end of the day, let's say you ran into two LE students and you asked how was your day or something like this, and they might. They might have gone through many of the same classes together, but the things that they would bring up, the things that were personal to them, the things that they would emphasize, doesn't mean that the other person's account is inherently wrong. And it's even part of the reason that while we do have many political historians out there in modern times who want to try to tell their side of things for their own personal agendas. There's also many times, as you even mentioned here in the scriptures, that the Bible can tell you there might be more than one way to accurately describe a situation without it inherently being that somebody's lying or somebody's contradicting. That there can be the Matthew way of being like, look, we're gonna base Christ's ministry in the Old Testament, and I mean he practically quotes more Old Testament scriptures I think than the other three combined practically. But it is a very interesting thing about again for all four of them, what they put in and what they didn't, and even deeper than that, what God decided to inspire for each of them to put in, and what things he was okay with leaving out. The Gospels are a great example where Christ lived, what we believe, about 33 and a half years or so, began his ministry at age 30, died at 3.5 years later, and I did the math on it at one point, because if you add up all the chapters, 28 for Matthew and however many for Mark and however many for Luke, however many for John, you add them all up, then add up the number of chapters that are just the last week of his life.
Right.
Just him riding in, or maybe not even last week, but he's riding into Jerusalem through his the Passover, the trial, the execution, the resurrection. That's almost a third of the gospel. It might be almost like 33% or maybe even a little higher
of what the Gospels recorded.
Right. That it's all that what God decided to record to you about 33 and a half years, a third of it's just 1 week. And even if we were to try to describe to you Christ's life from age 1 to 30, well, now we're down to just a handful of chapters, about what even took place there.
John O'Gwen did a Bible study, well, many Bible studies, but he has one where he takes the gospel accounts and it starts with three and a half years from the resurrection. Then he gets down to like 1 year to the resurrection. I mean, that's a whole Bible study. Then he gets down to 6 months before. Then it's like the week before is its whole own Bible study. To your point,
Yeah, what y'all said makes me think but two things. One is in terms of the accounts seeming so different, it really is interesting in terms of the world, the people who critique the Bible, which of course our young people are exposed to, critics of the Bible if they're in the world at all. And there are those that it's like they want it both ways. When the two accounts differ in some way, differ in the details they present, etc., the world will say, oh, look, there's a difference. There's a difference in the Bible. It can't be right. On the other hand, when they agree too much, they'll say, oh, there's collusion. It's all part of a plan. They're just weaving a tale. Mainly, they just want to critique the Bible. They don't really care. But in particular, I had an exchange on Twitter today. There was someone who, and they claimed to be a Christian. They believed they were a Christian, but they really did believe the Bible had these contradictions, and said that they didn't know what to do with things like the account of Judas's death. There's different details in one gospel account versus the other concerning Judas's death, concerning the purchasing of the field. And I just commented that no, those are reconcilable. There is a narrative you can put together because she said they could not be reconciled. I said, well, no, there is a way to understand. Well, maybe more than one, but at least one way to understand everything that certainly would include all those facts. And she just thought, no, that's just bending backwards. And I said, look, I have reared 4 boys. And there have been times where they would describe the same event, and each of them would give completely different details that if you just listen to those details, you'd have thought something completely different about what happened. But they weren't lying, they were just expressing the details they felt were important. And that also then relates to what you were saying, Mr. Robinson. Each of the gospel writers, like every historian, they have certain details that are important to them for what they want to say. The book of John, the one gospel writer who you mentioned, seemed to cover so many different accounts of the other 3, but he wrote apparently decades after the other gospels were written. And to a certain extent, and Mr. Gwynn would actually highlight this in his study, John was trying to fill in the gaps. He was trying to mention those things the other 3 had not mentioned. I've seen people who say, no, look, the book of John totally disagrees with the others. So even if you believe they were just out trying to propagandize the Christian faith, do you think that he would just completely, actively, purposefully contradict all the other accounts? That doesn't even sound... If anything, he would try to explain why those accounts were wrong and his account is right. It was quite the contrary. He was simply filling the gaps. And in terms of thinking of history biblically, in terms of even secular history, whether kids are studying it in school or whether they're hearing accounts as they grow up, that is part of what has to be taken into account, right? Is why was the historian writing? What are the kind of things that have to be considered when someone, Mr. Sandor, when someone is reading a historical account? What should our teens, what should us as adults, what should we take to a text, whether biblical to be sure, but even historical? If we want to think biblically, what is it we should take to the text when we're reading it?
Well, and I think, again, this goes back to one of the main benefits of history is that, when you study outside, you're going to have to go outside the Bible if you want to know anything about the ancient Greeks. I say anything. I mean, you might get a couple verses in Daniel, but it's kind of like, generally speaking, if you really want to understand, and actually Daniel might be a great place to start. Mr. Robinson and I were talking about 586 BC, great date to memorize. I'm not even a big date guy, but I mean that's a great one to have in your in the back of your mind to keep up, because 586 Jerusalem is conquered by Nebuchadnezzar. Or at least that's the best date we think it happened. And at that point, there's almost a narrative shift away from like the political entity of Israel, and now it's to the Gentile kingdoms. Nebuchadnezzar actually is about to have his dream of the idol with the gold and the silver and bronze and iron and so on. Well, if you're going to understand that, Daniel was going to help you at least identify it. But if you're going to want to learn anything about, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, or the Romans, you'll get snippets in the Bible, but there's so much more that you can learn from other sources, whether podcasts or whether books or whatever. So when you go to those, or if you go to something more modern, because part of the reason I've mentioned Stephen Ambrose, books about World War II, books about the Lewis and Clark, or even the Civil War, when we talked about Team of Rivals earlier, they almost might show you some of the blessings that God gave to the descendants of Israel. So you go to any of these types of texts, a lot of times you want to sit down and think, okay, who's the author? And not just a name. It'd be good for you to know the name, but what's sometimes their nationality, and that for better or for worse, they may or may not be intentionally trying to put their bias in, but it tends to give them a perspective on things. One thing I've never done, but I think would be curious, would be like, what if you could read 2 books on the War of 1812, and one's written by an American historian and one's written by a Canadian historian? What type of differences might be emphasized there? I mean, there's a chance that the Canadian historian would be like, and this is where we showed those Americans, and for the American historian might be like, it's kind of a stalemate, and I mean, who really cares? It's a draw, whatever. And
we didn't want Canada anyway.
Yeah, right. It's really cold up there. Yeah, it's just the Canadians might really celebrate it, and we're like, well, they have their Tim Hortons and they're happy with it, and that's and we went on our way. And neither side might necessarily inherently be wrong or trying to deceive you, but it just gives you a different perspective on things. And so you want to consider things like that. Now, as you go back to ancient historians, you might really want to consider maybe like who was paying the guy, because modern historians can go to a publishing house and they can get paid for using the printing press, which was not available to ancient historians.
Right.
And even the Bible talks with Luke in particular, that he mentions with Theophilus.
Theophilus, right.
And that they, who apparently was his patron and was taking care of his bills so that he could compile his history, because you need some time to do that, and that's not your product is going to take a while to put together. Now,
and also what audience you're
Yes.
you're writing to. Like we've joked about it a little bit this weekend, or this week that you've stayed here. Like Herodotus, he was a Greek. He was writing for a Greek audience in general. So his historical accounts swayed toward the Greek side of the version of things.
Yeah. Herodotus is definitely an interesting one, because he's been given the I was about to say nickname, a moniker. I don't know. There's probably a better
moniker might work.
But he's the father of history. Is kind of.
I've heard that. Of Herodotus, right?
Right. And so Herodotus, in some ways, he's given that title in part because he previous records of history tended to be almost like maybe a daily schedule. I did this, I conquered this, I did it's just kind of all right. And Herodotus was one of the first people who really added the color to it. And he lets you know who the characters are. And some historians today, I believe one of our podcasts, Mr. Robinson and I have listened to, speculate that maybe he was as much of a playwright or a performer on a stage.
Interesting, really,
as he was actually a historian, because. In the same way that if you read a book about something and then you watch the movie about the same material, there's going to be some differences. And Herodotus might have emphasized what really looks good on a stage, maybe over some things that maybe could have been more accurately stated in a document. But the hard part of Herodotus is, you want to learn about the ancient Greeks? You either read Herodotus or you got almost nothing.
And that's what you have, right?
It's kind of a dead end beyond him. So, but again, you recognize he's from this perspective. It was one of these podcasts we were listening to about the Persians, where he was saying, if all you do is listen to Herodotus, you would think the Persians are the worst people on the planet. They are greedy, they are effeminate, they are barely worth mentioning. Although I believe, if I recall correctly, he does this particular podcaster. You might have to remind me of his name.
Dan Carlin.
Yes, Dan Carlin. he would actually occasionally go to the scriptures to show, well, the Hebrews didn't quite have the same.
Using it historically, using the Bible as a historical source.
And it depends on the historian. Like the guy I like is Italian. You could just tell he does not think the Bible is a really credible source of history. But Dan Carlin seems to think that there's some things there that seem pretty. I think, didn't we say, like, it wasn't that long ago that nobody believed the Assyrians were actually an empire, and and then the Bible talks about the Assyrians actually in some ways
the Hittites.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it was roughly. I mean, probably just about 200 years ago or so when they started rediscovering Nineveh and all these places that today we take for granted. They're in all your history books, but there was actually used as some criticisms of the Bible during the 1700s.
Yeah, it's examples like that in the past were used to say, "Oh, the Bible, you can't trust it." It talks about these people. The Hittites didn't even exist. I think there were some historians nowadays would take it for granted that these people were great and the rest, but no one remembers the history of the people that want to claim their own personal authority that they're smarter than the Bible. That doesn't get brought up anymore. Now, Dr. Winnell, I do think brings those things up in his booklet on the Bible Fact or Fiction. I think that's a worthwhile point to make. I definitely don't want to cut off anything you would like to say to any of our young people listening, teens and young adults. But I did want to ask, for instance, we know universities can be a place where faith goes to die in a lot of ways. You've got essentially a bunch of professionals there and academics who have an agenda to get across, and they're all there to teach you what they want you to learn. So, I've got just one son who's about to finish his college career, one that's just kind of getting started. They've gone to various college or trade school and the rest. And they've encountered that. They've encountered sociologists, the rest, that have a certain take on things, and they don't mind just giving you their take. Is there any advice that you would give some of our teens and young adults if they want to maintain a biblical mind as they're going to college, as they're pursuing either higher education or training, or diving into some of these kinds of books? Is there any advice you would give them as a converted man that you are about how to take in that kind of information from these perspectives, but yet remain grounded in the truth and not lose your way based, because experts, when they write and when they talk, they can sound remarkably confident and convincing. I'm sure the experts way back then telling people there was no such thing as a Hittite sounded remarkably confident and convincing. So just in your experience with this particular discipline, is there any advice that you would give?
I think, and this is advice for a lot of different things, it's going to sound a little trite almost, but just keep your brain turned on. Don't assume that just because something's stated confidently that means it's inherently true, or that there's not necessarily another perspective. I've mentioned Stephen Ambrose because I've been reading some of his books lately, but he
should pay you for this podcast.
It really
You've really advertised his books very well.
One of the things I do appreciate about him, and it's one of the things I would encourage you to look for when you're reading histories, is that he's usually pretty honest about when he doesn't know something, when he can't nail it down. He did, one of his books was called A Band of Brothers, about a group of guys in a easy company during World War II.
Oh, that's Stephen Ambrose? I didn't know that. Okay.
And so he was able, he wrote the book, 20, 30 years ago, whatever, and so a lot of the men were still alive. He goes and interviews all the men. They all tell him exactly what they believe to be true, and he admitted that there's no way it can all be true. They were we know all those men were there. We know they fought in the same battle, and yet their descriptions and their memories had already meant that some of their accounts could not be combined. It was because this is not the Bible, right? These are just men's fallible memories, which all of us have. And so he had to try to sort through which things he thought was true and which ones are not. But he normally admitted that. At least he would be willing to say, this is my best guess as to what happened, because I do have conflicting accounts. And this is about something that happened less than 100 years ago. This is not the ancient history that where sometimes we can really be guessing.
And it's him going to primary sources,
right?
He's literally talking to the people who were there.
Yeah, exactly. the guys who were right. Literally boots on the ground, and he was there with them. And so you want to keep your brain turned on. I know I always mention it with entertainment. That I know if my sons want to go watch a superhero movie, it's going to be like, well, no, usually sounds great, but there might be a couple themes that are going to get dropped, or a couple whatever that we're going to have to keep our brains turned on for. And history can be that same way. And then so always kind of a maybe corollary to that is the idea that we would just ask your pastor, or get a multitude of counsel. If there's almost certainly, especially with history, it tends not to change very much. It is history, is kind of the same thing, that's there. Again, there's sometimes they rediscover the Hittites, that's they rediscover the city of Nineveh, whatever, there are some pretty groundbreaking things like that. But at the same time, like, frequently in the church, we've heard some of these things before. But what I always find the most encouraging about history is that if we actually approach it from a biblical mindset, where historians or teachers might be describing, how would they describe it? Well, it was fortunate that this happened, or, well, this was the circumstance, or whatever. And we actually see God's hand behind it, guiding those events. That when Lewis and Clark are crossing the Rocky Mountains, and it just happened that things worked out, that they didn't get snowed in and starved to death. And it's just we're looking for the bones of 30 odd young guys, however many years later. But no, that they actually made it across and made it all the way back, and that the Indians never wiped them out the entire time, despite even some questionable decisions that they made along the way. The author might present that as being like, well, the Americans are either really lucky or whatever, and it's kind of like, or there's a God directing some of these things and directing some of the paths on them. And so sometimes you have to be kind of careful to things that are chalked up for coincidence, or they remove essentially remove the divine hand behind it, where the Bible really gives us a framework to see that. Now, I also have one more, if you don't mind this, because here's the other danger, and this one can certainly happen in universities, is that ultimately there might be like a political agenda behind some of it, and so there's frequently a way to cherry pick history to make your case. Maybe a good biblical example would be that if you want to read about the kings of Judah, you can do it in 1 Kings, 2 Kings, or you can do it in 1 Chronicles, 2 Chronicles. Now, there's, let me see, I think I have the verses written down here somewhere, but and this is about David. 1 Chronicles 20, verse 1. Okay, now this is going to be the verse that says something like, well, it was the time of the year that the kings go off to war, and David sent out the army under Joab to go attack the Ammonites, but David decided to remain home in Jerusalem. Okay? Now, just with that introduction, where does the rest of this chapter go? And now, again, I actually mentioned Chronicles, but if you go to 2 Samuel, that's probably the one you're thinking of, because we might know things are going to go south for David's spiritual life very quickly with Bathsheba, and the rest is history, as we say. It goes into the very hardcore faults of the man. Mm-hmm. Or you can read 1 Chronicles 20, same basic verse to introduce the chapter, and then it goes. And David marched out and took the guy's crown, and he came back, and it weighed this much, and everything else. No mention of Bathsheba, no mention of any sin or any consequence of those things. And it's, again, kind of the reminder that, if someone only wants to, present the horrible things about history, well, that might be valid, that might be part of it, but it's also not necessarily wrong to focus on the good things about history, too, but there is a balance there. God gave us both 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, and 1 Chronicles, 2 Chronicles.
Yeah, it's interesting you say, and the rest is history. Had that not been recorded, it wouldn't be history. It would be the part of the kind of real unspoken history that is, it was a part of human events, but it wouldn't have been recorded without a second witness. You've actually got me thinking differently about God's command about having more than one witness.
Yes.
It isn't necessarily always that one is lying and one is not, but the additional witnesses have the potential to give you a fuller picture, and we're supposed to investigate things righteously. But I also pick up on what you're saying is it wasn't that the chronicler of the Chronicles. You see what I did there?
I like that.
Thank you. It wasn't that the chronicler of the Chronicles that he was trying to lie. He wasn't trying to lie. He just simply wasn't presenting that particular. He wasn't covering that facet of history. And so we need to keep our brains turned on and approach things recognizing that a historian is writing things for a particular. It's not even necessarily a bad reason, though. Sometimes it is political. Sometimes it is biased. But he always has to have a purpose in what he's writing.
And I think that takes us back to, thankfully in the Bible, we can trust that the author of Chronicles, the author of 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, that they were inspired by God and gave us what we needed. And you just can't necessarily take that same confidence to a history class or to books. And
even Stephen Ambrose?
Yeah,
because I hear he's great. A friend of mine loves his history books.
I hear he's great too. No, but even him, because again, now he generally falls in the trap of just describing things as circumstances and whatever else. He's not going to see God's promise to the tribes of Israel, to Ephraim and Manasseh, being played out in some of these things. But anyway, when you get more aggressive folks, who you might start sensing that agenda behind it, then you might want to say, hang on, are you trying to drive more of a political agenda? Because history gives you lots of stories about lots of things, and so if you want to, it's one of the dangers of people saying that you need to learn the lessons of history. Well, okay, but did you just cherry pick a few things where you might have picked the exception rather than the rule, or especially you're going into some type of anti-God, anti-Bible thing that is sometimes out there. I've had some professors who, I don't know that any of them were religious. Any of my history professors were terribly religious.
Interesting. But
at the same time, they also had to recognize a lot of the people they were studying were fairly religious, and I always find it kind of curious that if I could find a way to comment on religious things using the Bible and so on. Sometimes I could be talking about stuff I'd studied more than my professors had because they studied the history but not the Bible. And,
wow.
And every now and then that was actually a gateway to a good grade.
Things. I think that also as I've been listening to these history podcasts lately, is if they would just take the Bible as fact, it would really help them fill in some things and help them out with understanding history, which they do care. That's a passion of theirs. They love it. They want to know it. They love exploring it. Dan Carlin talks all the time about, you have to be like a crime scene detective and figure out, piece all these things together. And in some instances, I'm like, or you could just read the biblical account because it kind of fills in some of those. It depends on what he's talking about, but.
Interesting. So it sounds like, because Dr. Morell hits that theme a lot in terms of we need to learn the lessons of history. And part of what you've added to that is sometimes you're learning the lessons of history, but sometimes you're learning the lesson the historian wants you to learn. He happens to be using some elements of history to communicate. I think that's what Dr. Morell tried to bring out about, say, Howard Zinn's book about the people's history of the United States. Howard Zinn was pretty upfront that he's trying to communicate a certain point of view about American history and trying to counter other narratives. And then you have some who are just using his book alone as some kind of resource when it was never meant to be, admittedly never meant to be, an unbiased resource. He was upfront about his biases, and others have talked about the results of that. Wow, you need to get to an airplane. We're just about at that time.
We are.
Thank you so much for spending time with us, Mr. Sandor. And real quickly, I'll say, you have a wonderful wife. I look forward to seeing here pretty soon at the family weekend, Miss Amanda Sandor and your 4 amazing children. Just a quick test of how healthy your family is. Do you think they'll be looking forward to your return, or are they delighted you've been gone for a week?
I'm optimistic they're looking forward to my return.
Good. I think they always seem to love their dad when I'm there. I think they'll be very happy. Though Mr. Sandor's kids, if y'all are listening, feel free and let me know if it was a real bummer that Dad came home. I'm sure it won't be. Thank you again, Mr. Sandor.
Anytime.